their public policy. But I certainly try to engage colleagues in these areas. So I'm hopefully, will I be able to share? Yes, it looks like I can share my presentation here. Did I successfully share?
You did.
Okay, excellent. I'm trying to get to presentation mode. Okay, so again, complicating risk and rationality in the standard model. I'd say that this is a piece that I've been working on for some time, but it's definitely a work in progress and not really something that's in the wheelhouse of my work. But briefly want, for those who are not familiar with me, just to overview my approach to guns. I want to articulate what I think the standard model is and then complicate risk and rationality, and hopefully leave a good bit of time for question and answer and conversation because I really am interested to see what the oversights are, the gaps in my thinking, maybe even places where I'm just plain wrong. And so, if people just tell you what you've done right, and then you don't learn anything. So I'm looking forward to hearing people tell me what I'm getting
So,
wrong.
so David, in that spirit, your slides are not displaying appropriately. So in the
Okay.
spirit of telling you what's going wrong, so we can course correct,
Yes.
it's not in presentation mode.
Oh,
I
that's
see two slides together,
okay.
your current
So,
slide and your next slide, as opposed to one.
oh, okay.
Um,
Let me, I don't know. Let me stop share and I'll try to reshare again. Um, it looks like if I share this here, this is really the only option I have to
Showing it to
share.
you.
And then I go from current slide. Is it the same thing?
Now, yeah, I think so. We're seeing it in presenter mode, but I wonder if we
Oh,
can just, I think that can work. Can you make it larger, maybe?
that's, let me try and share something else here. I don't have
Otherwise,
an,
you can send them to me and I will share and you can just tell me when to move along.
let me
what,
ask is,
or what about using the little button at the bottom?
does that look any different?
No.
Nope. The little button at the bottom.
So
Yeah.
go. Okay. You see, go down. Okay. Okay. Go down to where your time marker is, near the bottom of your screen. So bottom
Bottom, bottom, bottom.
to the right.
To the right.
Okay. Now you see there's that go over one to the right there. Whoop,
Oh, reading
now
view,
go there. You
slideshow.
go. Now try that. Try that button.
Okay.
Okay. It doesn't work. That I don't, then I am at a loss. So I
Hmm.
think we just have to,
Well,
go through and
That's very curious. I don't know what,
once you started advancing, they are visible.
yeah, they're visible. We just had
So,
a commenter in the chat. So anyway, we did our level
yeah,
best.
I honestly don't know what's going on. So I will just press ahead and you all can have a sneak preview of what's coming. Hopefully you can see the main slide at least. Um, but again, this is my intention for today of what I'd like to cover. And honestly, when I say that I'm excited to have input, I am. But my approach from the start of my work on gun culture was really to look at, what I would say is a sociology of U.S. gun culture. So I say in my first kind of publication in the area that despite the fact that a robust culture centered on the legal ownership and use of guns by law-abiding gun owners exists in the United States, there is no sociology of U.S. gun culture. Rather, the social scientific study of guns is dominated by criminological and epidemiological studies of gun violence. And so, this was basically my getting into a new field and doing what we all do when we get into a new field is start reviewing the literature and really finding, very little that was done on, what I thought to be my primary interest, which didn't have to do with crime and death. But that's where the center of gravity of the scholarship was. So I started to, kind of articulate what I thought a sociology of U.S. gun culture would look like. And I really centered on the idea of gun culture 2.0, which I guess I'm probably known for within the field of gun studies, really the shift in the center of gravity of American gun culture over time, from earlier pursuits of hunting, recreational shooting, and collecting, more towards self-defense as being the center of gravity of gun culture today. And I'll actually try to complicate that a little bit, hopefully, if I get to it at the end, having wasted some time already. But the most recent piece I have on that outside of my book, which takes a more kind of personal view, is this piece, Gun Culture 2.0, The Evolution and Contours of Defensive Gun Ownership in America, which actually came out of a wonderful conference that was put together at the University of Connecticut by some colleagues here today, that was lubricated by, some great friendship and conversation and maybe a little alcohol. But this was, I think, an important point. And if anybody wants to kind of know my most updated views from an academic perspective of Gun Culture 2.0, that's the piece. It's available in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Open access also, thanks to our friends at the UConn Arms Center and others. So, more fundamentally, I think the approach that I try to outline in the book is that guns are normal and normal people use guns. This is the fundamental sort of assumption that I came to in the course of my work and that I've tried to really build upon since, which means, two senses. First, guns and gun ownership are common, widespread, and typical. And second, guns and gun ownership are not inherently associated with deviance or abnormalities. So this is the ground from which I work. Now, so what does this have to do with the standard model of explaining the irrationality of defensive gun ownership? In trying to keep up with all of the scholarship that's being done on guns, I really came to see that there was a standard or a most common or a modal way of explaining defensive gun ownership, and that it did highlight the fact that defensive gun ownership is irrational. Now, granted, here I am poaching in many areas of which I'm not an expert. I've tried to read everything I can. I don't read everything. And so when I say I'm laying out this model and I'm sort of highlighting what I think are some of its shortcomings, I really am interested to know if there's anybody in the audience today who works within this model or thinks that they don't work within this model, but it's wrong. Really looking forward to those comments. So let me just quickly run through the model itself. I'm not going to present the whole model. There's actually some pieces that I'm leaving off at the end because I think those are good for a conversation for another day. And again, I developed this because in reading a lot of articles on sort of negative outcomes with firearms, I felt like I was reading the same paper over and over in certain ways. The setup of the papers and what the point of the papers were seemed to be have a lot in common, which is great. This is what we might scientifically call a paradigm, right? A standard model is a sort of paradigm that makes academic work a lot easier because we just fit our work into an existing paradigm. But if parts of the paradigm are wrong, then I think that those, or maybe limited, we need to shore those up. So the standard model, does begin with the recognition of gun culture 2.0. So I have no quarrel there. Here I'm using Nick Buttrick's piece, Protective Gun Ownership as a Coping Mechanism, which I think really is a kind of pure embodiment of the standard model. But, here he begins the piece by recognizing two distinctive gun cultures, one for hunting and one for personal protection. Now, that's a truncation of something that I've spent a lot of time arguing about or articulating, but, that's a fair summary that, today gun culture centers on self-defense and personal protection. Second, the standard model discounts the need for or utility of guns for defense. So this is kind of what this looks like. And again, Nick Buttrick in the second paragraph of his piece, gun owners rarely use their guns to prevent victimization. Okay, so discounting the need there. Here's Wolfgang Strobe's piece, actual defensive gun use is rare. Right. So you see this repeated quite frequently throughout the literature, the need for defensive guns. Most times, I would say almost exclusively, though I wouldn't stake my life on that. There's the references to the epidemiology of self-defense gun use based on the National Crime Victimization Surveys. So you could see in those pieces and others, this is typically what is cited when the claim that self-defense gun use is rare. Also, discounting the utility of defensive guns. So here, Strobe, there are strong arguments to be made that for most people, guns are neither needed for self-defense nor very useful when the need arises, right? So again, discounting the need for and the utility of defensive gun use. And here, the data provide little evidence that using a gun in self-defense reduces injury, right? So again, I think fairly uncontroversial in my view, although maybe folks have a different view, but I see routinely discounting the need for and utility of guns for self-defense. And in fact, the standard model holds the opposite is true, that guns actually add risk, right? Rather than making you safer, guns actually make your lives more dangerous. They add risk. Here again, Nick Buttrick, in contrast, bringing a gun into one's home clearly makes it more dangerous. Lots of citations possible here, but oftentimes going back to the OG, Arthur Kellerman's pieces in 1992-93, suggesting that this view has been long baked into this kind of approach. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with Kellerman's pieces in 92-93, these are where our statistics that a gun in the home makes you 2.7 times more likely to be a victim of homicide or 4.8 times more likely to be a victim of suicide. So if guns are not needed for or useful for self-defense, but that guns add risk, defensive gun ownership is irrational. The cost benefit analysis is in the negative for the defensive gun owner. And this actually is an even older idea than Kellerman's work. The irrationality of defensive gun ownership can be found as far back and perhaps even further back, but this is as far back as I've found it, as Newton and Zimring's Firearms and Violence in American Life from 1969. And you can see he kind of sets up the same idea about people owning guns for self-defense. And he says possession of a gun undoubtedly provides a measure of comfort to a great many Americans, but the data suggests that this comfort is largely an illusion, bought at the high price of increased accidents, homicide, and more widespread illegal use of guns, right? So the costs are greater than the benefits, in a sense that it's not as just an illusion, or I would say in irrationality, right? And here, David Studdart's work on handgun ownership and suicide suggests the persistence of the idea. So he says this information is important for current and prospective gun owners seeking to weigh the risk and perceived benefits of ownership. There he doesn't say outright that the risks outweigh the benefits, but saying the risks and perceived benefits really, to me, says it all, because the benefits are only perceived, the risks are real. And so it's actually said a little bit more clearly in his other piece on homicide, right? If firearms ownership enhanced personal safety in other ways, as many gun owners reportedly believe, tolerating some elevated risk for suicide might be considered a worthwhile trade-off. This study adds to mounting evidence that no such trade-off exists, right? The risks of defensive gun ownership are greater than the benefits, right? So again, no quarrel with the first one, and then discounting the need for utility of guns for defense. It holds the opposite is true, and therefore defensive gun ownership is irrational. In points 5 and 6 of the standard model, I kind of outline how, if guns are irrational, why do people own them? But I think for our purposes here, I'd like to stop there and then talk a little bit about how I see things a little differently, or maybe more complexly, or just sort of complicating a couple of the ideas in this standard model. Oh, I forgot to mention, we see the standard model sort of routinely gets drawn up into public conversation about guns. So in this recent piece from CNN Health, David Studdart, really articulates basically the standard model, almost in its pure form, in the comments that this author from CNN Health quoted him using, including using the National Crime Victimization Survey to say that guns are rarely used in self-defense. Okay, so let me complicate the story, and again, hopefully leave plenty of time at the end to hear people's responses, because I'm interested in complications of my complicating the story. So, for me, the risk of gun ownership and the rationality of gun ownership is really not either or, but it's really much more of depends. And so I actually spend 2 chapters in my book about American gun culture talking about risk, especially from the gun owner's perspective in chapter 6 on Pascal's wager in firearms. And then in chapter 7, the longest chapter of the book actually deals with guns as risk factors for negative outcomes. So, not I'm no risk denier here. So, are guns risk factors for negative outcomes? Absolutely, yes. Right? Guns are potentially lethal tools, and as some people in the gun culture like to say, that's a feature of guns. That's not a bug, right? That's not something that you try to work out of guns. That if guns were not lethal or didn't have a lethal potential, they wouldn't be useful for us in all sorts of different ways, right? In terms of self-defense, or in terms of hunting, or in terms of even sport shooting, we might say. So absolutely, guns are risk factors. So this is much more about thinking about in what ways are guns risk factors rather than saying guns are or are not risk factors. So the presence of a gun is a precondition for a firearm homicide, suicide, or accident, which, is true as far as it goes. But I think in a sense, it doesn't really go that far, because if we look at drowning rates, for example, we know that the relative risk of drowning in Hawaii is 4.5 times as high as it is in Pennsylvania, right? So the presence of water is a precondition for drowning, in the same way that the presence of a gun is a precondition for a homicide, suicide, or firearms accident. So how then does that lead to sort of complicating our understanding of how guns are a risk factor? And here, again, my reading, my statistical training and my methodological thinking, which dates back to the 1990s when I was in graduate school, I think that there is some overconfidence in both case control models and also use of statistical controls in trying to isolate guns as a risk factor, right? So the 2.7x or the 4.8x or whatever relative risk ratio is found, is really only correct if we get a perfectly matched control sample or get all of the statistical controls exactly right. And I think in studying human beings, this is just really hard to accomplish, right? Which is not to denigrate the work. I have here a picture of Arthur Kellerman in Seattle at the National Research Conference for the Prevention of Firearms-Related Harms, speaking to a former student of mine at Wake Forest who's now completing her PhD in the field of gun studies. And so, again, I want to be critical here without being dismissive, because I know that there are a lot of people who sort of dismiss work in this field entirely. My issue is much more, again, trying to complicate, trying to add maybe some humility in terms of the conclusions that we want to draw. And the fact that Arthur Kellerman is still out there trying to understand these phenomena, I think is amazing. I hope to be retired at that age, but who knows, maybe I'll be compelled to press on, right? So this method of trying to identify the effect of an isolated risk factor, I think, is also problematic insofar as we're whole people that are not easily disaggregated statistically, right? And again, I have done many multivariate statistical models, written papers on this, where we're trying to isolate the effect of some variable, ceteris paribus, right? All other things being equal, what is the effect of this one variable? I understand why we do this as social scientists. I understand the benefits of it, but I also, think that it needs to be understood again, somewhat more modestly in the sense that I don't think that it's ever the effect of guns in and of themselves can be isolated in that way, right? Either in a case control design or in any other design in which we're using statistical controls, because guns increase some people's risk a lot and they increase other people's risk much less, right? And this disaggregating style of isolating risk factors or attempting to isolate risk factors, I think is, correct statistically. It's problematic when we apply this in the real world, whether we're trying to inform people about wise decisions to make in their life, whether we're trying to inform policy, if we're trying to help the media to understand the work we do, right? I believe that it's not the isolated effect of a gun, net of all other factors or ceteris paribus conditions, right? But it's always a gun and something else, right? Or multiple other things, right? So gun and an abusive relationship, gun and alcoholism, gun and street involvement, as I recently heard in a presentation on this book on Wilmington, Delaware called Murder Town, USA, where in fact those authors don't primarily look to the gun at all as a factor leading to violent outcomes in that community. They really see violence as the primary driver, and the gun happens to make things somewhat worse. Okay. Also, on the other side of the equation, right, it's not just the presence or absence of a gun, but it's the presence of a gun and other possible risk mitigation practices. So the attitudes that people bring to gun ownership, the training that they might have, their storage practices, right? So, I think that the mere presence of a gun in a household doesn't have a risk independent of those other complicating factors or mitigating factors. The other, way I like to try to think about this has to do with, relative versus absolute risk. And again, totally understand why we use relative risk when I understand the risk of drowning, right? I sort of compare different locations by using the relative risk, right? But I think it's also important to know something about the absolute risk of something happening, right? If people are going to make informed decisions, they need to know something about not just the relative risk, right, but also the absolute risk. And here, I like to look at David Studdard's piece on handgun ownership and suicide in California because I think it's a tremendous study. The fact that they were able to advance beyond case control designs to use a cohort study, which really, again, gets us even closer to that gold standard of the, double-blind clinical trial. But again, here, because exposure is self-selected in a cohort design and we can't control for all of those self-selection factors, we have to have some modesty in interpreting even the relative risk. But here I want to talk about the absolute risk. So not sure, really hope this is big enough in my double screen system I have working here. But this is, I think, the real payoff figure in the Studdard piece, right? They're looking at here it's a little sort of maybe counterintuitive. It's your likelihood of living. It's not your likelihood of dying, right? This is the likelihood of your living over the 144, 145 months or 12 years of time that they have data for, beginning at the moment handgun enters a household. So again, the cohort design here is quite brilliant. So this is the additional risk that's brought about by being a handgun owner, risk of suicide. So you can see there's quite a substantial gap there. I should have noted, but I think they say that the additional risk or the relative risk ratio is between 2 and 3x, but don't quote me on that. But when I show this to my students, they sort of immediately notice something interesting, which is that the scale of this graph is from 99.6 to 100. Right. And, not accusing Studdard of being deceptive at all here, but this really highlights the fact that there's something else going on in addition to the relative risk of death by firearm, suicide by firearm, which is that the absolute risk is quite small. And so if we take out that part of the diagram, and again, Studdert provides all this. He's not trying to hide anything. But if we look at the absolute risk on a 0 to 100 scale, right, the additional gun owner risk is there, right? And why is this? This is because almost nobody in this study died of a firearm suicide over the study period. And the gap between those who did and have firearms and those who didn't is quite small because the absolute risk of death is quite small, right? So again, everything we need to know to interpret this study and its implications is right there. I just think that this would be a bit of a complication if we always mentioned the absolute risk in addition to the relative risk. Because again, if I'm considering bringing a firearm into my home, that's probably something that I want to know about. All right, let me quickly go through the rationality side of the issue. I definitely want to leave time for some conversation, so hopefully I'm not rushing too fast. So, the rationality of gun ownership, has to do with, I say, this, pro-gun and pro-gun control equation, right? Who assumes how much risk from gun ownership is a complicated factor, I've tried to say. And the rationality of gun ownership also depends on this benefit to risk ratio. So what are the positive effects or benefits of guns? Less the negative effects or risk of guns, and that is the net effect or the rationality of gun ownership, right? And again, are defensive gun use is rare and useless, right? Well, certainly this is part of the standard model. It's something that gets drawn up into our public discourse all the time, right? So this idea that they are rare and useless, that guns actually bring more risk, and therefore this is an irrational decision. It's a myth, it's a delusion, etc. Again, uh, is it rare? So the National Crime Victimization Survey, as the RAND gun policy report states, and I think this is pretty widely accepted as a neutral arbiter of what's going on in research, right? Uh, at the same time, we would be foolish to believe that there's 2.5 million DGUs a year. At the other extreme, the NCVS estimate of 116,000 DGU incidents per year almost certainly underestimates the true number, right? So all of this talk about the delusion, the irrationality, the myth of defensive gun ownership gets based on an estimate that is the lowest estimate, right? An extreme estimate, as Rand says here. Um, and this, takes us back to the issue of defining and measuring what is a defensive gun use, right? What counts as a defensive gun use, and how we define defensive gun use, right? The scale creates the phenomenon, will affect the number of defensive gun uses that get counted, and then that gets factored into the rationality equation. So, I wouldn't wade quickly into this area. It's a terrible area of scholarship. There's been mostly just acrimony about it, and so I can understand why people haven't really done much work on this. But when the Pew Research Center called me to talk about questions that they should ask on their gun owner survey, I said it would be good to ask a defensive gun use question. And I think that the question should really ask whether the person fired the gun or not, right? And that not every defensive gun use involves the defender discharging their firearm. So this is the question they came up with, not including military combat or part of your job. I think a useful qualifier. Have you ever used a gun to defend yourself, your family? They also asked her your possessions, which I didn't like because, I think ethically, I don't know that we should be defending our possessions with firearms, but they asked. And they said either by firing it or by threatening to fire it, right? Which I thought was cool. And they found that of all adults in their survey, 7% or 17.5 million people answered that question. Yes. So 17% of gun owners, also 9% of people who were not currently gun owners, but had owned guns in the past. And, even 1% of non-owners who have never owned a gun. So, this would be interesting cases. But, I'd say not a small number of people have used guns in self-defense. And so as we're thinking about the rationality of that, then kind of makes sense. And then the question of the uselessness. This is a very complicated study, one I've assigned many times in class. I've tried to read it many times and understand some of the subtlety here. But some of my top line takeaways in terms of whether using a gun in self-defense is useless. So we know that 83% of everybody, reporting to the NCVS said that they weren't injured in the incident, right? If you took a defensive action, that dropped to 75%. So if you didn't do anything, that's 89%. If you attacked or threatened to defend yourself with a gun, you were at 89% not injured, right? So in my view, this is a higher percentage than all of the respondents, right? So 7% or slightly under 7% more people who attacked or threatened with a gun were uninjured compared to the entire sample, right? And it's better than taking some action other than using a gun, right? And we also might think that people who used a gun in self-defense might have been in a more extreme situation where they were more likely to be injured rather than less. So, just sort of on the face of it, to me, this suggests the conclusion that defensive gun use is not useful in preventing injury just doesn't seem to be correct to me. So again, my reading, not so rare, not so useless, not so irrational. And then, rationality also, I think, depends on other non-defensive benefits of gun ownership. And here, I'll probably try to wrap up. I think that the standard model really does specifically address people who own guns for self-defense. And I feel like I'm sort of partially responsible for the simplification of gun ownership by saying that, gun culture 2.0 is the center of gravity of gun ownership today. But that's also a limiting perspective insofar as most people own guns for multiple reasons, right? Very few people own guns solely for self-defense. So if we want to talk about the rationality of gun ownership more broadly and not just defensive gun ownership, right, we really need to take into consideration some of these other reasons for gun ownership, right? And again, reifying gun culture 2.0, which I'm guilty of doing myself, right? We can get a study that says that 78.8% of gun owners are defensive gun owners, right? That's true. But it's also true because the question that was asked was, what is your primary motivation for gun ownership, right? And if we ask what's your primary motivation, we are going to limit the range of possible responses, right? The scale creates the phenomenon, which is different than asking a question that allows people to say a range of responses, right? Is protection a major reason, a minor reason, or not a reason? Is hunting major, minor, or not a reason, and so on, right? And I think if we divide the pie this way, things look a little different. Again, I don't deny the existence of gun culture 2.0. I would not, have a position in the field if I did that. That's clearly evident in this data. But 52% of people also say that hunting is a major or minor reason for gun ownership. Sport shooting, 59% major or minor reason. Gun collecting, 41% major or minor reason, right? So, the question of why do I own a gun, right, is a way of asking a question, or what is the primary reason that I own a gun is an interesting way of asking a question. But I might also say which gun, right? I own 12 guns, right? So why do I own those 12 guns? For all sorts of different reasons, including for personal protection. So again, I think that problematizes or maybe complicates a little bit the question of rationality. All right, I'll stop there so that I leave a decent amount of time. I think some of these other things are just me riffing on some other things that I think about when I think about gun culture, but hopefully that gives us a little bit to chew on, and I welcome people's questions and comments.
Thank you so much, David. I think you gave us quite a bit to chew on, and I expect a really good discussion. So we are happy to take questions. If you use your hand icon or symbol, you raise your hand. I'm happy to call on you. And before I do, Mary, I'm just going to remind you all. In the chat, I just put the link to the on target submission form and RSVPing and our website and any other information you might need to contact us. Okay. Mary Bernstein. Mary, you're still muted if you've started. Maybe Mary put her hand down. Somebody else. Did anybody else have a question?
Yes, this is Mike McCoskey from DPH, an epidemiologist and program coordinator for the Connecticut Violent Death Reporting System. Two things, Dr. Yamane. One, I have purchased your book, and I have a similar situation that you had when you decided to pick up your gun. Never in a million years did I ever expect to be a gun owner, but once you get threatened and your threat is 50 yards up your driveway, it was time to protect yourself. When something happens, there's not going to be a police cruiser in your driveway. I know they're responding, but sometimes time is of the essence. And, I would hope that my gun ownership, in this case, the shotgun, would be deterrence. That, you have enough time to present your shotgun. That would hopefully would stop them. And then two, once you rack the pump, that would be another instance of deterrence. And with regard to Connecticut data, I had shared data with Carrie. She's on the Connecticut Firearm Commission. We're in a subgroup of data, and there was a request of Connecticut violent death reporting data regarding firearm suicide deaths, non-firearm, and the same for homicides. And in Connecticut's very unique in that the number of non-firearm suicides is probably about 2.5 times higher than firearm suicides. In the case of homicides, firearm homicides are probably about 2.5 times higher than non-firearm. And in your model, I think I need to reevaluate how I present my data, perhaps as absolute risk. That I think would be a better showing of how firearms are used in violent death in Connecticut.
Yeah, I think more of a statement than a question, so move on.
Mary, go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay. So my question is this: what would you say are the main policy implications? Because I always think that there's a big misrepresentation of the gun violence prevention movement, that they're coming to take your guns away, and really, at least in my research, nobody's doing that. And and so you talk about rationality from the point of view of the owner, but what about the rest of us in society? And I think so. I guess I'm wondering, what are the policy implications? And I think about stand your ground laws, and I think about the movement toward open carry and no background checks, and really compared to other countries, the sort of staggering rates of gun violence in the U.S. comparatively. So even if, from the sort of personal, owning a gun may or may not be rational, but also, safe storage in your car so that people don't, I've talked to police chiefs who basically say, yeah, people who want to steal guns, they look for the NRA stickers on cars, and those are the cars they break into. And, laws about straw sellers, safe guns, things like that. So I'm wondering, what are there actual policy implications in terms of, because as far from where I sit, people aren't trying to say like nobody, no one should be allowed to have guns, but they're very much about, do they belong in, public venues? Should there be reciprocity for concealed carry or open carry? So I'm wondering, like, what kind of implications your work has for those questions?
Yeah, I think that I don't feel obligated to have particular policy implications of my work. As I said, I'm not a public policy scholar. I'm not a public health scholar. But I do think that we should look for ways of reducing the downside risks, either individually or socially, of firearms in ways that impinge the least on the vast majority of gun owners who do nothing wrong with their firearms, right? And we know that and again, I think back to I don't know if you meant to the Murder Town USA
Yep.
session in Phoenix, but they didn't talk about we need to control guns in order to reduce gun violence in the city of Wilmington. So we know that there are lots of ways we can reduce these things. We know that there are groups that are working really hard within the gun owning community to reduce suicide. But, to your sort of question, I think the thing I could say most clearly is that, here I am looking at the individual rationality or irrationality or risk of gun ownership, because I think that's where the standard model is at. There is another side of this that I haven't sort of fully built out, which is talking about the societal irrationality of that. So you could take that benefits, risks, net model and apply that socially. And I think that there's been some, interesting work in that area that tries to investigate whether the liberalization of gun laws is on balance leading to a net negative for society. And I think, I think about John Donahue's work, and I think a lot of that really stalemated debate over whether more guns means more crime, really needs to have the black box linking those two things enlightened. And I think Donahue's been doing some good work here. And he's not, I don't think, finding that it's people who legally own guns and carry guns in public are creating those negative outcomes. But there are these mediating mechanisms, as you said, like theft from cars. Also, maybe the lowered likelihood of police investigating crimes that are taking place where there are lots of guns on the streets and these sorts of things. So, I think that's an open question, but one that some good progress is being made. But I don't pretend to be a public policy scholar, so I would be way out of my depth making recommendations there.
Yeah, thanks. And just, yeah, and I was at that talk last week, and studying similar things to what the folks who wrote Murder Town do. I mean, many times what they're concerned is the flood of illegal guns, and the fact that there's really a kind of political unwillingness to crack down on gun dealers who know exactly, straw purchasers who know exactly where the guns are going to. And the folks I talk to, they don't want and I agree, under root causes is absolutely the way to go. But in addition, not having the flood of illegal guns, and there's a lot of real, practical things one can do to reduce that from happening.
Jen, you're muted.
I know. Jillian and then Carrie. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a social worker and I happen to be a school shooting survivor. So I really appreciate all these talks in general. But my question is, it's just like a technical question about when you were saying that when you were measuring at-home deaths in general, like taking a broader look at it, and you were like comparing at-home deaths of guns, you're including accidents in those, correct?
I think that the studies that I cite from Kellerman, I think look at suicide and homicide. I think they exclude accidental injury and death,
Mm-hmm.
which thankfully is an incredibly small proportion of all gun deaths in any given year. I mean, it's primarily suicide, followed by homicide, and then, if we wanted to count mass shooting deaths separately, then that would be there. And then I think even, well, there might be more accidental deaths than
I will
mass
say,
shooting deaths.
yeah, I might be wrong, but it is one of the leading causes of children dying is accidental shootings. Um, so I don't know. I just was wondering about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think this is something that, gun owners and non-gun owners alike, do not want, children to have access to firearms and to injure themselves or others. And, so I think that there have been developments along these lines that, as I understand it, I think this is coming from Garen Wintemute, that, over a long period of time, the number of child accidental deaths in the United States has declined pretty dramatically, which is awesome. Which is not to say that, I think as people within the gun community themselves say that, zero is the only acceptable goal for, child accidental deaths. And, again, I think people being responsible and securing their firearms from unwanted access. This would definitely include, to Mary's point, keeping your gun unsecured in a vehicle. And a locked vehicle is not a secure location.
Mhm.
And certainly, people gaining access to those firearms who shouldn't have access is an issue that needs to be continually addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Carrie.
So I have a question about it's a little bit policy, it's a little bit sociology. Also, David, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for coming today. As it relates to defensive gun use, we often talk about this as a utility, but I want to also put it out as a disutility. And this idea that private citizens shouldn't have to feel like they need to defend themselves. And that is it is actually, as a public policy person, a core function of government. And when we sort of allow government to just like abscond on this core function, and when we move the function of safety and security away from the public domain and into the private domain, we're going to get a lot of error than we already have, right? Like we talk a lot about, law enforcement training, et cetera. Well, no one's training like private citizens in a, coordinated fashion. There may be educational training. States may require training, sort of, regular intervals for permitting. That's the exception though, not the rule. But I also want to and I also want to be fully transparent. I have carried a gun defensively, and I'm actually really mad about it, right? I actually don't think I should have to do that. And so, when we present these numbers as like, this is a major reason, and we say, okay, look, people want this. I actually think there's a counter argument that people don't want this. And it's in response to a general equilibrium in society that we don't want to see happen. And to Mary's point, thinking about the role of public policy, we've seen an enactment of public policies that sort of make this reality like worse, right? Like permitless carry, we see gun shooting incidents going up specifically around men, white men, that are ages 40 to 45, right? Like the sort of exact demographic you wouldn't think necessarily. So anyway, I just want to push back on this idea that defensive gun use is a utility. I think it's a disutility, but I would love to hear a sociologist speak to that.
Yeah, I think that there are uh, different views of this, right? All the way from, the sort of vigilante mindset that would say, we're all in it, we're all out there for ourselves, and it's up to us to defend ourselves in society as private citizens, to people who, as you suggest, carry firearms but wish they didn't have to, and I think that this is, maybe fairly common in places where they have high rates of social violence, neighborhoods where they have high rates of social violence, that, they carry a gun because it feels like a necessity for survival. But I think that there are different modalities then. So, I think you have people who are really just, I don't dial 911 because I don't trust the state to protect me. And that can be, all the way from someone who's very conservative all the way to someone who's quite sort of left and radical. And, there are people, I think, sort of maybe in the middle that I might include myself in this category of, yeah, I generally trust the state to protect me, but I know the state can't be everywhere, and I don't want the state to be everywhere, right? And so, I think greater appreciation of some of the variability there would be significant. And I'm dodging the question as to utility, disutility. I know many people within the defensive gun owning community who say, I would gladly give up my guns if there was some way that I could be guaranteed that I will never need them. Right. And so I think that's one of the root realities, is that we do not, cannot, and will never live in a society in which every aspect of our safety can be 100% guaranteed. Right. And
Certainly, of course, and this goes back to your risk, right? But I think, so speaking as a survivor of domestic violence, right? And the state in areas of orders of protection, when the judge tells you from a bench, it's just a piece of paper. And when law enforcement refuses to go get the gun from your abuser, right? Like these are, I agree with you. We don't want the state to be everywhere, but there are clear places where we know that not just is the victim of domestic violence safer, but we're all safer, including law enforcement, the general public. And so I think, to also to Jillian's point, and perhaps Mary's, there's more that we can do, I think, to minimize the cost of firearms and the benefits of firearms, and that it's not a zero-sum game. And so anyway, I appreciate you bringing some of that out today. I'm gonna yield. I know there's one more question and we're getting short on time.
no, I just say that's a terrific way of putting it. Depending on how you set up the calculus, it can make it seem like it's a zero-sum game.
I think I'm the next question in line, so I'll go ahead. I guess my question is, like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the risk and uselessness sort of like element to this conversation, which I know is the whole conversation itself, but for me, I'm like trying to digest this. So I guess my question might be more related to research, and whether or not there's research existing on the questions I'm going to ask, but sort of two parts is, are other weapons, like let's say knives, baseball bats, that are sort of thought of as used for home defense in certain ways, someone who might not own a gun may use those items, included in this type of research, right? Like, are we asking people, hey, do you keep a baseball bat by your bedstand, and have you ever had to use that? Or like, do you keep a baseball bat in your car, and have you threatened folks with this, and has that been a successful use of, sort of those questions that were being asked of, have you had to use this? Even if you don't own one, has this been a protective factor for you, so to speak? And, in the situations in which people who own guns were asked that question, they were like, yes, I did use it and it helped me protect myself. Is there, like you talked about multiple times, are all the factors being included in that question? Well, what weapon did the other person have, right? What were they being threatened with? If someone's like, hey, I have a knife, give me all your money, and they're like, well, I have a gun, is that protecting them more? Or if them also having a knife, would that have equally as much deterred the person in the situation? That's my first school of thought. And also playing into that, I guess, is how is the lethality of guns being portrayed in this research? So like, I think it's I believe that this is a fact that, you're more likely to survive a knife wound than you are a gun wound. And how that is playing a role in it of, that a knife could be a kitchen knife, right? Like it's not necessarily always a weapon, or a baseball bat is a sports use. We're pretty typically a gun's most use is going to be shooting a person, shooting an animal, shooting an object, and how that plays into all of this. And I
Yeah.
apologize, I know that's a lot, but
Yeah, no, I'll try to answer quickly. I mean, I think the lethality question is very appropriate because, again, one of the things about guns is that they are lethal, right? There are tools that can be used for lots of different things, but they're very well suited, to doing that kind of damage, right? And so this is why, it has such a high case fatality rate in suicide, for example, or why
Mhm.
places that have more firearms have more homicide because it's much harder to kill somebody with a knife. So I think that any, calculation of the risks and benefits of firearms really has to take lethality seriously. In terms of like other weapons, I don't think anybody is really doing a kind of comprehensive surveys of what are all of the things that you are doing to try to ensure your safety. And I often say, when people feel a sense of insecurity, some people get a dog, some people buy a security system, some people move to a gated community, right? And some people
Yeah.
will get a bat, or some people will carry pepper spray, and some people will get guns, right? And I don't think that those are all equivalent choices in terms of the risk that you incur from that. But it would be interesting to see, the range of possible responses that people engage in. I don't
Yeah.
think that's being done. It's not my area, but it's possible.
Yeah.
And then, just in terms of the details of, what do these defensive gun uses look like? I think that the National Crime Victimization Survey doesn't get into that much detail, but it would be interesting to know much more on a case by case basis. What do those defensive gun uses look like? Was it appropriate or not? But I think that you sacrifice generalizability there, right? So the number of
Right.
cases that you would have to get in order to do that fine-grained analysis and also be generalizable would probably be cost prohibitive. But it would be a great study for a graduate student or even an undergraduate to dig into some case accounts of what these things look like.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, okay, good to know. Yeah, I was thinking that was sort of like, sort of the polarization, right? Of like, no, guns are terrible, or oh, guns are great. And it's sort of like, well, there might be an in between of like, maybe you could utilize another weapon that is going to deter someone from harming you, but isn't going to end in death in
Yeah.
this, or, as much risk or something. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's
Well,
why
thank you.
sorry, I just try to use the term complicating because again, I don't want to, be misconstrued as saying guns do not introduce risk into people's lives, because they certainly do. But I don't think it's as simple as saying, you are less likely to do A than B, and therefore this is irrational for you to do. So complicate risk and rationality.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, David, so much for sharing your work and engaging in this discussion. I wish I could stay longer. I wish we all could, but I actually had our stop. But Arms has more to do today. But we really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your sharing. We appreciate all of you coming and joining us and your questions in the discussion. We hope you continue it without us, and we hope to see you all in March.
Thank you all. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's good to see you.